Carolina. I'm not going to cover all the species, so you don't need to worry about a 3-hour presentation. There are indeed 18 species of the genus, which is Rhododendron, that are recognized in North America. Most of these are in Eastern North America, especially in the Southern Appalachians. So we've got a nice diversity here in the Southern Appalachians, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, as well as a little bit of Tennessee, and even as far north as Kentucky and Virginia. Now, where are most of the rhododendron species on the planet? Asia, Himalayas, incredible diversity, probably about 3 times as many species over there than are over here. And indeed, a lot of the cultivated plants that we see around our houses and even here on our campus are those Asian species that have been brought over here, which sort of makes you scratch your head a little bit and go, why didn't we work with the natives? And I don't have an answer for that one. Meanwhile, I just wanted to make sure everybody's clear on the use of the term rhododendron versus azalea. The rhododendrons are the evergreen species. That means they keep their leaves year-round, while the azaleas are the deciduous species. They're going to lose their leaves during the wintertime. As you get over to Asia, that definition doesn't work out as nice and neatly. But here in the Southeast, it works out just fine like that with azalea versus rhododendron. There are indeed 10 species found in South Carolina native. I'm going to look at 3 of these species for this talk. First of all, Rhododendron eastmanii, the May White Azalea, that's only known in South Carolina, so that makes it special for us to think about and look at and for me to study further. Rhododendron minus is also known as the gorge rhododendron. Some people refer to it as punctatum, and that name's been used here and there and been pretty well long known in the Southeast. Rhododendron carolinianum, or the Carolina rhododendron, has only been recently picking up steam in terms of being a validly understood species. And there's still problems in comparing this gorge rhododendron and the Carolina rhododendron. I'm going to try to work a little bit with trying to work that idea out with the talk tonight. So here we have our May White, and this is one of the more satisfying pictures that I've made of the species from right here in Newberry at Lynch's Woods. We've got the gorge rhododendron from up at Sassafras Mountain. For those that are keeping up on geography of South Carolina, you know this is the highest point in South Carolina. And then here we have the Carolina rhododendron from Chestnut Heritage Preserve in Greenville County. So those are our 3 characters we'll look at a little bit more tonight. Start with the May White. Some people actually use the name Santee Azalea, being that one of the earliest discoveries of the plant was at Santee State Park, which isn't all that far from the Congaree Bluffs area that we've been concentrating on recently and noticing things. And then the other early observation was along the Broad River, or near the Broad River at I-20, so on the north side of downtown Columbia. This plant itself is a moderate-sized shrub, and it typically grows on slopes above streams. Hello? Do you have a question? So it's found along streams. The Congaree Bluffs is really unusual in that it's found on the steep bluffs 100 or maybe even 150 feet above the river. The plants flower in May for the most part, therefore the May White, and we already saw the white color on the flowers, so the May White is a nice name there. And then those who were out in the field trip Saturday got that introduction to the strong, sweet odor that plant has, very distinctive. And I've had a number of times, including last Saturday, where I smelled the plant before I saw it. So that becomes, when those plants are in full flower, it's really amazing. This plant has only been known as a species for 22 years. 1999, it was first described. And it was only known from those 2 locations at Santee State Park and then along the near I-20 in the Broad River. It turns out that the earliest aficionados of the species included a Charles Eastman, who was a surveyor and working on building I-20 back in the 1950s into the early 1960s. And he liked azaleas, and he found native azaleas and planted them in his yard, and he saw this unusual form there, and he said, you know, can we move the interstate over a little bit so we don't disturb this population? And then later on, he introduced it to Mike Creel, who was one of the co-authors on this new species in 1999. So there's where Eastmanii comes from, named after Charles Eastman. After the work, I got first introduced to this plant in the year 2000 as I was asked if I knew anything further about it, and I was not the rhododendron guru back then. And the investigations I've done over the last 20 years have resulted in now we have 74 populations in 13 counties. And I'll show you a little map there where these things are found. So here's another picture of those plants, those bright white flowers, sometimes bright yellow blotches on them, sometimes not so much. In this case, you can see just a little hint of yellow in there, and then you can see the little bit of pink there on the stamens. And that's going to be all part of that variation in it, and I'll show you more pictures to see what kind of variation we may have. Ecologically, this plant is found on slopes above streams, sort of between that wet bottom of a floodplain and the dry ridges above, and it prefers a sandy loam soil. So a lot of sand in there, say 70%, 60%, even 80% sand, well drained. And then they're found also mature hardwood forest. In particular, white oak is a dominant species. Sometimes we'll see some species of hickories, sourwood, red maple, black oak in there. So those are all things that are being found with it. And then also the other thing that's always found, Christmas fern. So are white oak and Christmas fern rare species? No way. They're all quite common, but the idea is when you see those two there, you are feeling pretty confident that you're going to be able to find a proper habitat where the May whites might be found. Relative to distribution, once again, this is an endemic of South Carolina, found only in South Carolina. And most of these populations are found on the Broad River, which becomes a Congaree River basin. So north of Columbia, we have the Broad River, all the way up to, and actually into North Carolina, we have the Broad River. Up there, like near Lake Lure, is the beginnings of the river, but no plants in North Carolina, only in South Carolina. And then at Columbia, as the Saluda River comes in, it becomes the Congaree River, and then on down and joins with a few other rivers before it gets to the coast. Relative to counties, Calhoun, Lawrence, Newberry, and Union counties are the counties where we find the most populations. So here we have a little map of South Carolina. The red stars represent where the plant was originally found and notified in the publication in 1999. And then my work since then has produced all these things. The dark circles represent at the top, to the north and or to the upper left-hand side, there's Union, Lawrence, and Newberry counties. And then on down between the two stars, we've got Calhoun County, where we're finding more and more plants along the Congaree Bluffs area. So that's going to be a continued area of interest where we can find more. The spot that's sort of missing in all this is Lexington County. We've not been able to find any in there. And I'm not sure whether it's because of the sand hills and a really sandy soil. The plants sort of skip the sand hills per se, that 90 or 95% sand, and just need more moisture in order to do well, as do most of the azaleas, need extra water. And you can see some of the other counties. The northernmost population is at Cowpens National Battlefield Park, 3 miles from the North Carolina state line. So of course, I've been encouraging the North Carolina folks and actually helping them, asking that question of, hey, anything up there in North Carolina? And so far we haven't found anything. I was out last year west of Charlotte, walking in a little preserve that they had set aside, and there was an azalea up on the slope, and I said, oh no, is that it? No, it was something else. So almost, but not yet. Still a South Carolina only plant. Two major projects that are ongoing with the May White. First of all is going back to the Sumter National Forest. There are some of these populations I found and documented 2000, 2001, 2002, so quite a while ago. And so I'm going back to those sites and ask the question of how these populations changed. Have I missed plants? Are these populations increasing? Are they decreasing? And so I've been tallying how many plants are in flower, how many plants are vegetative, and then indeed, how many seedlings are out there? Are these populations increasing by adding new individuals through seeds germinating and growing? For those that are not quite familiar with the Sumter National Forest, we've got 3 districts in there. The Newberry district with the big arrow, and then down toward the Savannah River, we've got the Long Cane district, mostly in Edgefield into McCormick counties, and then up there in Oconee and Pickens County, we have the Andrew Pickens district. So the May Whites grow quite commonly there in the Newberry district. With those 3 counties, Union, Laurens, and Newberry are all part of that national forest area. So I've got a cost share agreement over the last 3 years and continuing through this year to go back and resurvey populations and potentially find new populations. And all of this is within the Piedmont. So we got the coastal plain, the Piedmont, and then a little bit of mountains there to the west. So here I am in the National Forest having a look at some May Whites on the slopes. Those that saw those plants at Congaree Bluffs area, way, way, way above the river, here we got some that are not too far above a stream bottom. So just a slight bit up, and then there's a lot more slope going up above it. So there's a little variation in how far above the stream there is. Probably a lot of that has to do with how much of a water body is. So a little ephemeral stream that dries up during the summer is not going to have as much moisture as the Congaree River. So you'll see differences in the specifics of where they grow. Here we have another picture in Union County. Once again, that yellow blotch is showing up on these particular flowers, but the pink or red, not at all present. The stamens are all white from the little yellow tips, but no pink to it. So that's another variable that is not unusual. Here's a close-up from the Congaree Bluffs picture I took a year or 2 ago, showing and emphasizing that yellow blotch on there. And you can see some pink then on the stamens, but the petals are pretty much all white. So how have these populations changed? Being that I've been out there in the National Forest 3 different years now collecting data. And early on, we found 22 populations in the Sumter National Forest between 2000 and 2010. And being that we're 1919, 1920, 20 and 21, hadn't been seen for as much as 20 years. So wanted to know how they have changed. So I've started this survey in 2018, and we're running all the way through this year. And we want to survey mostly during the month of May because plants are so much easier to find when they're in flower. First of all, the white color shows up nicely. And then secondly, that odor is very distinctive and allows us to catch these things when we otherwise might not notice them. So the first 3 years of our project, we found 20 new populations. And these new populations found either by we're walking through a ravine on a small stream and then say, hey, what about the next ravine over? And so go down to a stream, another stream that it runs into, and then go back up the next one, and whoa, there's some more plants. This is exciting. And then sometimes I would look at the topographic maps along with the aerial photographs. So all the technology we now have become part of and can use that wasn't around in the year 2000 or was very scantily available. And so now I can put those bits of information together, see a steep slope. Let's check to see what kind of vegetation we got. So maybe a lot of hardwood forest in there. Says this will be a good place to go. Let's check it out. And so I found 5 new populations just based on checking out the maps and aerial photographs and coming up with some potential places to go visit. So there we have 20 new populations as a result of the surveys over the last 3 years. Here's an example. This is in Newberry County along Long Creek west of Newberry. And so the big red arrow, the letter B, those were the populations that I knew about long ago. So like 2005, there they were. So I came back then 2 years ago and I said, well, let's go upstream. So down toward the bottom, letter A, we found a few plants there. That was pretty neat. Let's now walk downstream or go to the top of the map, and found a few, and then walked for ways, maybe a half a mile, and nothing. And then all of a sudden, oops, there's a plant. And then I said, oh, this other tributary is nice north-facing slopes. I bet we can find something there. And they were nice 50 to 60-foot slopes. And sure enough, plants started popping up. And over there at letter C, we found a mother lode, almost 100 plants on this steep, steep slope, reminiscent of the bluffs there at Congaree. And their new plants just loved it. It was opened up because the trees couldn't grow on those slopes very well, and that elevated change in elevation allowed for more sun to get in, but not necessarily direct sun. And so these plants just were doing it, and it was just loaded with plants in the flower. So there's an example of intensifying and redirecting the survey to catch another ravine and ask that question of, are they over there also? So that was pretty neat. So through 2013, we discovered somewhere in the ballpark of 550 plants. And I was counting mostly just adult plants, nice big plants. And I didn't really think about surveying for seedlings. In the last 3 years, we've come up with almost 1,200 plants, 550 seedlings, adult plants not flowering 600 plus. And then there's our flowering plants at 550. So almost 4 times as many plants by going back there and resurveying. So becoming an important part of that story of understanding this in more detail. Here's an example of a little seedling close up there. So you can see this guy is just a few inches tall, got a few leaves on it, probably in its 2nd year of life. And then it probably grew that much by the end of May, and it's going to sit there and hope that a deer doesn't come along and munch away on it. And then the next year it'll grow another, maybe double it or triple its height and start becoming toward being an adult plant. How many years does it need to grow before it flowers? I couldn't tell you. Maybe 10. Also, another area of interest is along the Congaree Bluffs, and this is just part of this research we want to do along the Congaree Bluffs, is to look for more May White Azaleas, but also look at and just be amazed by the differences from the floodplain up to those top of those ridges and what plants are there. And the part that really pops up as a really neat thing here is that we're getting some mountain species that are showing up here. The mountain laurel is not unusual to be found outside the mountains, but that indicates something about a nice, cooler, wetter area. And then we're starting to find some of these other plants like the silverleaf hydrangea. And the question is, what else might we find? So we'll be looking for and seeing what's in there. Are there rare species in there that might not be found too many other places? So a lot of opportunities to find things there in Calhoun and even further east in Orangeburg counties. So we'll be working on that, and we're going to be asking for volunteers, and we've already got an incredible number of people that are excited and wanting to be part of the story. So that's great, and everybody can have an opportunity to make their contribution and some have already done more than their share of work toward this. So interesting to see that. For the May Whites, they tend to be toward the top of these slopes, which is just amazing to me that they're not found further down slope. But that's just part of what we learn as we go. Here's an example of some of these slopes. This is a picture taken in the winter time, and we can see nice beech trees in there as well as some other plants. We got some Christmas ferns in there, still green in the winter time. And then here's the place, the infamous cliff there on the Arant property, and right smack in the center of the picture, believe it or not, is a May White Azalea. And then over to the lower right-hand corner is a mountain laurel. And then other plants are there as part of that interesting little community exposed over the Congaree River. And I noticed a lot of people took pictures of the river from there. And it is a quite impressive place. The other thing that's interesting about these plants is some of these plants can just be loaded with flowers. And so here's an example of a shrub that probably has well over 100 flowers on it. And this is part of the idea of why these things smell so much, and you can smell them before you see them. So many plants, and it has a plant that grows up tall, 6-7 feet tall, and then it just does like a mushroom and just goes out, and then you get the top of it sort of dome shaped and is covered with flowers. So quite impressive when it does that. And then here's one last picture of some May Whites before we move on to our other species of discussion tonight. Okay, the other plant that I wanted to talk a little bit about is this gorge rhododendron, or rhododendron minus. And some of you are familiar with the giant rhododendron or the rose bay rhododendron, which is probably one of the most common rhododendrons of eastern North America, all the way from Maine down through the Appalachian Mountains, all the way down even into Alabama at the very southern tip of the Appalachian Mountains. These are evergreen species, and this particular one, the gorge rhododendron, has sometimes white flowers, sometimes pink, and then sometimes even purple. So we see a lot of variation in the flower color. But one thing's for sure, they don't have any odor to them that we can detect. These are also referred to as the lepidote species, in that they have these small little, almost microscopic scales on the inner side of the leaves and on the stems. So here's one picture showing that at the upper left-hand corner. You can see those individual little scales on there. And then collectively, as the leaf gets older, they'll turn to a sort of rusty brown color. Young leaves that are out right now, those things are all still greenish, and upper surface and lower surface of the leaf pretty much look the same. But by the fall, they'll have darkened out, and you'll see these little scales there. You'll also see them on the stems, and in some of the pictures that we go through, you'll see those little specks, or what look like little specks on the flowering stem and the regular stem of the plant. Here's what the fruits look like on them. You can see the evergreen leaves that are present. Just give you an idea of that. They look quite different than your typical azalea fruits, which are typically a lot more elongate, and then the long tail-like structure, the stigma, typically falls off on the azaleas, but in these guys, they hang on for quite a long period of time after they flower. The reason why the gorge rhododendron and the Carolina rhododendron have been confusing to figure out is that there are differences in the flower color and the floral tube in terms of its length. And people have been looking at it at different perspectives over time, and some of them say, oh, look, interesting enough, over toward the coast in Chesterfield County, Lancaster County, we got these plants that have really long tubes, and then the petals of the tip are pretty small. Meanwhile, you get up toward the mountains and the tubes are a lot shorter. And so some people say, well, is that just all part of one species? It varies. Is that different species? So there's been some question about that. As we get toward the end of this, you'll probably still be confused. I'm still somewhat confused, and we'll work through this over time. So here we have some from Chesterfield County. There's that long, skinny tube. You can see that on the flower off to the right. So that tube is really long. It sort of slowly opens up into the actual individual petals. So that's about the longest as they get. Then we get up toward, I believe, Sassafras Mountain, and we have a much shorter tube on these flowers. And so some people, and of course the color is a little different too. And so some people ask the question of, well, is that all part of the same species? Here's a map that I generated a few years ago when I said it's all gorge rhododendron in South Carolina. And as you get in the higher elevations in South Carolina, in other words, over 1,000 feet, we got Oconee, Pickens, and Greenville counties there to the west that have the most, and plenty of populations over there. Very easy to find it. Flowering usually in May into maybe even early June. But then we get some other stuff. And getting over there to the coast, there in the right there in the middle of the map, we've got the Columbia area, Fort Jackson area has some plants there. And then the upper right-hand corner, we've got Marlborough, Chesterfield, and Lancaster counties that have a few populations. And then in between, we don't seem to have anything. So what's going on there? So that was a confusing story. And here we have the variation in the flower color. The right-hand side, we got the much darker purplish color, and then over to the left is sort of a pinkish color present. So, and then we have some plants that are almost completely white. So here's a close-up. This is what it looks like at Sassafras Mountain. You get a shorter tube, darker color to it. This is the same type of material we're going to see over in northern Georgia and in western North Carolina, say like near Cashiers, that area. So all that stuff all has the same color and even floral shape to it. So that's a nice unit to look at. And then we got these guys here that have a much lighter color to it. So a little bit of a pinkish, purplish tint to it. And so those add a little confusion to the question. Then we got this guy. And here we have a lot wider tube, a shorter tube, and then the lobes or the petals that stick out from it are longer than the tube. Well, this is what people are calling the Carolina rhododendron. And notice how white the flowers are. And you think, oh, we got it all figured out now. No, you don't. Because it turns out as you go further north up to Linville Gorge area, those flowers are purple. So, yeah, we get these patches of different colors and patches of different flower size. So in general, what most of the rhododendron folks have sort of agreed on is that as we look at the big picture, we have the Carolina rhododendron or rhodo. We have the shorter floral tube. The flowers early, as in April into May, and it tends to be the more northern species. So it's found all the way up to Linville Gorge area and is abundant in Greenville County. Then we have the gorge rhododendron. We have the longer tubes. They flower a little bit later, and they flower typically about the time that mountain laurel flowers. And this sort of is one of those components that helps us to understand what's flowering when, because for those that don't know, mountain laurel flowers actually as early as April on the coast, where it's found in spots here and there. And then up in the higher elevations, say at 4,000 and 5,000 feet, it still hasn't opened up yet. So we see that variation. And so the idea is, let's put this in perspective in terms of saying it flowers earlier or flowers later. But if a Carolina rhododendron and a gorge rhododendron are sitting near each other, about the same elevation, their Carolina rhododendron will flower about a month before the gorge rhododendron. So we get that variation. And what happens is we get into western Greenville County, we actually have the two species within a mile of each other. And one of them will flower and be done with almost white flowers. And then here comes the purple one almost a month later. So the Carolina rhododendron is finishing up now. Meanwhile, the gorge rhododendron is getting ready to flower. And apparently in some spots it's already starting to open up, but it'll be at its peak in about 2 or 3 weeks into June. So go up to Sassafras Mountain, for example, in the second week of June, you'll find these plants doing nicely up there. So here we sort of have the 3 circles representing the 3 different forms of this thing. So over in the coastal plain, we got these long tubed, white flowered rhododendron minus, gorge rhododendrons. So they're sort of outliers on the coast with the long tubes, and everybody's happy with that. I'm not too happy with that, and wonder if eventually we might have somebody do some DNA sequencing and say, oh, that is different. It turns out that stuff actually matches up with stuff in southern Alabama. Real long tubes, white flowers. And actually they all the way over to western Alabama. And then Georgia, for some unknown reason, does seem to have this stuff in the coastal plain. And then we get the rhododendron minus with that purple flowers there in western South Carolina, Oconee and Pickens County, and a few over down into Anderson County. Go west into Georgia, all over the place in northeastern Georgia, northward up into spots in North Carolina near Cashiers. There's a place called Toxaway Mountain, and some areas there around Macon County, Jackson County, that we find that in that area. And then you take the other point, the carolinianum stuff from Greenville County over into Spartanburg, and now we've documented it in Cherokee County, and then take that northward, and the flowers start out white there in South Carolina, but as you get up further toward Linville Gorge, they shift over into a purplish color at the northern end of their distribution. So beginning to make a little bit of sense of this, but still I'm not satisfied that we have the full answer. So we need some more work here to figure out what's going on in the coastal plain versus in our foothills. Why is the flower different color? Some of them white, some of them purple, some of them pink. And then the tubes of different shapes. So in general, what we find is that this gorge rhododendron, or rhododendron minus, is a more southerly species with longer floral tubes, variable color though, from anywhere from white to a purplish. And they seem to flower about the same time as the mountain laurel. And here we have a picture. Here's one from Greenville County at the extreme western part of the county. And here we see some more of that with that purplish color to it. And then here's the extreme eastern stuff over in Lancaster and Chesterfield counties, that long tube and the white flowers, just like you find in southern Alabama. And then here's some more of that same thing. I think I actually had this picture toward the beginning of the slideshow. And then the Carolina rhododendron, Rhododendron carolinianum, has a more northerly distribution, a shorter floral tube, also with a variable color to it. And it flowers before mountain laurel flowers. And here we see some here along the Broad River in Cherokee County, as well as up into North Carolina. And see, there's that shorter tube there with the petals being longer is what people like to see, or the professional botanists want to see for that species. And then there's that flower, mostly white, sometimes a little bit of pink to it, until you get up into the mountains. And there's another one from Greenville County showing that almost completely white component to it. And this is just south of Caesar's Head State Park on US 276. If you drive that mountain from Highway 11 up to the state line there, you'll see plants along there, and they're actually flowering right now up there at Caesar's Head. I was there just a few days ago. So we've got these, what we call these lepidote rhododendrons, and just give you a reality check even further, there's not just 2 species, there are now 4. So we got the rhododendron minus of Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and then even a little bit of Tennessee. The carolinianum is only in South Carolina, North Carolina, going northward up toward Boone. Chapmanii is a Florida only, and it's got much smaller flowers on it and sort of a pinkish purple flowers, much smaller plants. And then as of 2021, 2 months ago, we now have a new species called Rhododendron smokianum, found only in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And this guy grows in this real brittle shale formations called the Anakeesta Formation. And what happens is, as plants start growing, they get their little roots in there in the cracks of the shale, freeze and thaw in the winter, the plants grow, they squeeze them apart, and then next thing you know, the trees can't be held, so they get blown over, the shell gets thrown away, we get this open exposure, and the rhododendron comes in there and finds its way and does great in the full sunshine there in the cooler, higher elevations of the Smoky Mountains. Very short floral tube. And here is an example of this clip. This is Highway 441, just south of Newfound Gap, going down toward Gatlinburg. And then on that side of that cliff are a few plants, but a lot of that stuff is this Rhododendron smokianum. And 2 years ago when I was up there, I caught it right at the tail end of the plants flowering. So here's my picture. These short tubes and long petals sort of crush everything in together. And so the result is you get this tight cluster of flowers. Notice the purplish color on it. And then I actually did a little bit of cut and paste from the publication. And you can see that flower off to the right. There's hardly any tube. It's almost all lobes sticking out. And so that's one of the main distinguishing features on that. And then indeed, this plant has been known as being different for a long time by some of the rhododendron folks. But nobody was willing to stick their neck out and say it's a new species until a German botanist said, let's sequence some DNA. And sure enough, it popped out different from the other ones, the other 3, the minus, the carolinianum, and then the Chapmanii from Florida. So it really did stand out relative to differences in DNA. So that was impressive, and that was a good anchor then to say that. And this sort of brings up this whole idea of we as humans sometimes have a hard time telling apart various species that nature understands very well. And so we only get this smokianum in the Smoky Mountains. The other species don't go up there. They don't grow up there. They stay away from that Great Smoky Mountains National Park. So that becomes a very interesting difference in geography on that species. And that's the end of my slideshow. I'm ready for any questions you all might have.
Charles, have you looked around in Lexington County much at all for the May White?
I have looked there, and maybe I need to spend some more time looking at the topographic maps, look for some slopes to see if I can't find it. In my gut, I'm saying it's got to be there somewhere. And okay. Mike Creel keeps on asking me, who is one of the authors of May White, and he lives in Lexington County. And so he's thinking he hasn't found it, I haven't found it, but that doesn't mean it's not there.
Charles, a couple questions. what do you think the status would be on, like, for instance, the May White? Do you think it's been given a status like as being rare, endangered, or anything like that? And my other question, pollinators on these rhododendrons, what do you know about them? Are they really specialized for certain species of moths or bees? What do you know about that?
Okay, relative to the rareness, one of the things that we've been working through is a status. And for those that don't know, the Nature Conservancy years ago helped work on establishing a 1 through 5 rating. And that rating can be statewide, national, or global. So state S, N for national, G for global. And a G1, S1 are all going to indicate really, really rare. So there's where that federal listings of threatened, endangered, and heaven forbid extinct. May Whites are sitting at about a statewide, it's an S3. We've probably got over 5,000 plants in the state. So shame on me for finding all these plants to make it not so. And I actually was on the phone for about an hour with some folks from Nature Serve, which is one of the segregates from the original Nature Conservancy. And we talked about the whole thing. And the lady I was talking to, we sort of ran through the criteria for each of the different levels. And by the time the phone call was over, we had agreed that it should be an S3. So pretty secure. We've got places in the National Forest. They know about it. They're willing to support not logging those areas on these slopes to endanger populations. So that's a positive there. And we've got a bunch of private property ownerships too, including along the Congaree Bluffs. And Dave, you know very well that we've got a lot of people down there that are all in favor of supporting these plants. And then the other half of the story is, how are you going to develop those steep cliffs anyway? So yeah. Second question on pollinators. That is a question that has been asked, and I've seen various type of bumblebees / carpenter bees. I've seen tiger swallowtail butterflies visit, but I have not sat there. You know, let's sit at a plant for the whole day and let's watch to see what kind of pollinators come in morning, afternoon, evening. Some plants will have their strong odor certain times of the day, maybe early in the morning or late in the afternoon when it's warmer. And these May Whites seem to let that odor out all day long. So another project to work on.
Well,
What kind of pollinators, what are the most, and then I had some pictures even with some ants on them. What are the ants doing?
Well, you know, I keep bees. I'm a beekeeper, and generally, most of the nectar that bees bring in is in the morning, and then the nectar will dry up later in the day, and then after that, that's when they mostly go foraging for the pollen. And well, I don't know. I'm just throwing that out. You know, I think that's an interesting observation.
Well, it's always good to have these conversations to think about things, because something you're thinking about, which in your mind might be some weird idea, might think, well, hey, why not? Let's test it. Let's see. And I will say that I have not seen honeybees on the plants. Have you? No. So other questions?
This is Jerry Bright. I put one in the chat. Azaleas are are said to be poisonous to most animals. And you mentioned earlier that the deer will eat the young. I guess maybe it's like pokeweed. You can eat pokeweed when it's young, or what's the deal on that? And how would that affect the nectar for Dave's bees? Would the nectar be poisonous also?
The plants, I think you hit the nail on the head. They munch on the nice fresh growth. So fast growing stems will come up. They're the ones that get nipped off. And then the older leaves tend to hang on there. I don't know what the palate of the deer are like in terms of the taste changes as the leaves get older. And I haven't tried chewing on leaves. So, and I don't know. I haven't heard anything talked about toxicity per se, but it's clear that deer are munching on plants. I've seen a bunch of plants where they've been nibbled back down to whatever growth they had for the year. How does that affect the nectar? And this is a very common phenomenon of one part of the plant will be poisonous or toxic to the herbivores, but the pollen is no problem. And that may be what's going on here. Once again, the other component is that something that is harmful to us may be perfectly fine to other species. Classic example, poison ivy. Those white seeds, you don't want to eat those. That's going to be nasty. Birds eat them, no problem. They're not affected by those resins, oleoresins that are produced that cause the nasty response that we have. So some interesting ideas there. And once again, something else to be tested. Are the deer really munching on the young stuff? And why aren't they munching on other stuff? Here's somebody posted a little idea saying that pollination by ants is very rare, and indeed, typically plants that are going to be pollinated by ants are things that are going to be low down toward the ground. So my comment of the ant on the flower is probably just a random event there rather than they were pollinators. Would probably be a better answer that I should have given. So good point.
Charles, on the color variation, you know, with the different rhododendrons, just wondering, do you think that's caused by soil type? I mean, you know, having to do with the different acidities, maybe? What do you think?
I know that some plants, indeed, the acidity of the soil does change. For example, some of the hydrangeas will have variations in flower color as a result of the soil chemistry. That might be something that's worthy of doing some more work. I've had students collect soil samples. We have not done any with these rhododendrons to see if there's differences in the acidity of the soil. But maybe that's something that might pop up as part of the interesting story. And another written comment, May White are for sale. I thought they were. Let me pop up. Oh, they are for sale. How long does it take for them to grow from seeds? I would say probably about 4 to 5 years from seeds. That one picture I showed of the seedling was probably a second-year plant. Some of the azaleas, believe it or not, can actually go from seeds to flowering plants in less than 2 years. The little dwarf azalea over in the coast, my German friend, I sent him some seeds, and he germinated the seeds last year in spring, and he said this year they were flowering. He said he was amazed at how fast it went from a seed to a flowering plant. So he was especially happy about that. These May Whites, typically a plant that's less than 3 feet tall is not going to flower. They typically wait until they get up 5 or 6 feet tall. So I'm guessing 4, maybe 5 years before they're going to be flowering plants from seed is my guess. I haven't germinated seeds, so I don't know for sure. But some of the folks who are in the Georgia Rhododendron Society probably can tell you a lot because they've come over here to collect seeds and then germinate them and grow them. So they probably have a good answer to it. But I'm guessing somewhere in the 4 to 5 year range.
I'm kind of wondering, you know, you mentioned, what is it? There's another species out in Alabama, you were saying, that compares to what we have over here.
Yeah, I've been over to Alabama, and the plants over there in southern Alabama, near Troy, look very, very similar to stuff we have. That long tubes, the white flowers, and so it matches up. And it'd be neat to look at the genetics of that and see if indeed they match up. And you know, you wonder what happens historically in terms of, you know, 500, 1,000 years ago, what was the terrain of the Southeast like? You know, during the 17 and the 1800s, we had a heck of a lot of South Carolina was cut down and made into farmland. And then it's only been in the last 50 years that we've said, you know, let's set aside some spots. And of course, we had Congaree that was not touched. And now we've let other places come back. And Sumter National Forest is a classic part of that idea of letting these floodplains establish themselves and continue growing on their own without any harvesting. So those have allowed for things to come back. On the field trip on Saturday, somebody was asking about, what do you think the original distribution of the May Whites was? Was it more extensive back in 1500 before Europeans started marching westward and settling and modifying the landscape? And I'd say probably yes. How much more so? I don't know. Questions with no answers. How long does it take for a plant to spread from one location to another location? And for those that don't know, the seeds in these things are very small. We're measuring them in like a 1/16 of an inch or 1 or 2 millimeters in size. And so those very small seeds, one little fruit might have over 100 seeds in it. And then if you got a plant that's got 100 or 200 flowers on them, each one of those produces fruits, or say only 75%, you're going to have a few thousand seeds produced. And then most people agree that at least some wind is picking them up and moving them, at least in terms of 50 or 100 feet, but maybe not. And maybe they make it over to the ridge to the next little valley, and maybe that's how they get dispersed there, but probably not long range unless, of course, we have these nasty storms that come through every once in a while called hurricanes. And who knows how far things could get scattered with that. But if you're looking at establishing a new population, it may just take one of those every 50 years to scatter them to new drainages, if the habitat's appropriate for it. Once the plants get established, such as in cultivation, we can move them from one spot to another pretty easily, and they can handle growing then in conditions that in nature for that germination and early growth was not suitable. But with a larger plant, a little bit of human care, they do fine.
Are there any other distinguishing characteristics if you're looking for these plants during non-blooming periods? Is there anything else in the foliage or that could lead you to think that you may have a May White?
There is, and this is where we get to the point where the flower buds for the plants are produced by August. So you can look at a plant in August, September, October, and you can tell if it's going to flower the next year. The flower buds are about 3 times bigger than the vegetative buds. And it turns out on those buds, if you peel away the little itty bitty scales on them, the edges of them will have these little dark glands on them. And that's a characteristic of that, as well as the flame azalea, which is up in the mountains.
Okay.
So that's typically what some people look for. And I've seen a population in the fall. I'm thinking, I'm not sure if this is a May White, but then I'll take one of the little flower buds and start peeling off those little itty bitty scales and like, oh, this is a May White. Or, nope, not this one.
So those dark glands, they're pretty easy to see with the naked eye?
Yeah, you can see with the naked eye. A hand lens would really help a little bit more. And
Okay.
the outer ones don't have those little glands on them. And as you start peeling them away, the ones underneath will have them.
Okay. Anything about the branch formation, just the morphology of the plant, or Anything along?
That is a true challenge. I cannot spot them. Usually I know which one it is by where it's growing.
Okay.
So for example, today I was up on the Pacolet River and I saw a plant near the river and it had already finished flowering completely. And then I would say, yeah, it's the pinkster, because that's the only thing in that area that looks like. But otherwise, if you gave me, say, out of a nursery and plop the plant in front of me and say, which one is it? I'd say, I don't know. Because the pinkster, the Piedmont, and the May White, and for that matter, the flame azalea, look vegetatively almost identical. Once they flower, though, definitely you can see the differences.
And have you seen them on places other than the slopes?
Up at cow pens, the ground is relatively flat. And so that was sort of out of character. And I've seen them sometimes near the bottoms, but typically it's that ephemeral little headwaters. And so they'll go right there next to the spot there. And you think, oh, well, it's at the bottom there. And you might have a 100-foot drop down to it, but it's a headwater and it's only got flowing water. And like I was out on yesterday, and we found some plants and the little creek just had the little pools in them. That was all. There was no more running water, but high. And then it was about a 6 or 7 foot bank on the creek, and there the plants were sitting there at the top of that little itty bitty ledge. So a miniature bluff of just 5 or 10 feet as compared to what we see there at Congaree of 100+ feet.
Okay. I'll be looking around Lexington County because I live in that area, and I just walk in a bunch of different areas, and I'm trying to think of things that you know, when I'm in those locations, I'll start looking.
Yeah, this is the time to do it. During the other thing that was sort of interesting is a little aside point was the plants grow down there at Santee State Park, which is like 150 feet elevation. And then they grow all the way up in Union County at 550, 600 feet elevation. And I thought, oh, the ones down there at Santee will flower a lot earlier than the ones at the higher elevation up in the upstate. Nope. The ones at Santee State Park were just starting to open last week when I was there. And then meanwhile, some plants up there in Union County, they were in full flower and even past their prime. So there isn't the differences in the elevations between those two areas in South Carolina are not enough to do anything. Compare that to the gorge rhododendron, where the stuff over in Chesterfield County was flowering the last week of April, and then the stuff up in Pickens County at 1,500 feet won't be flowering for another 2 weeks.
It doesn't make sense.
So different species apparently are picked up by the thing. And the other thing that's always interesting is most of us know that springtime start. When does it really get warm, and when do the plants start coming out? And things like the pinkster to flower really early, as early as early April, even late March, they'll vary widely from year to year. The May White, there's one May White Azalea at Lynch's Woods Park here in Newberry. You can set your calendar to April 25th will be the first day they are open.
How about that?
And it's happened like that for 6 or 7 years in a row, regardless of how early or late the first plants to sprout out after winter. Very consistent.
Incredible.
Charles, you were talking, or somebody was talking about how you could perhaps tell different species by when they bloom, you know, and I was wondering if these two that are supposed to be the same species, has it been genetically determined that they are the same, that bloom at different times?
There has been some DNA work to show that they are different, but they are, compared to other species, very similar. And so one of the things that we can look at is, instead of looking at a particular set of genes, is start looking at other genes and see if we can't find other differences and work through it that way to see how much difference there really is. When the molecular biologists are studying things, they're just sampling little itty bitty pieces of all the DNA, and they're not sequencing the entire set of DNA, or what we call the genome. So you're getting little bits and pieces of it rather than the whole story. And, you know, that's where technology's got to move forward, where we can start getting to the point where we can take a species and sequence everything and then use that information. That's going to be more powerful than sometimes a hit and miss. And one of the things I've been working with pawpaws is getting somebody to find the right genes and look for differences in those species. And they'll come back and say, nope, no differences at all between those. And it's, well, hold it, we've been calling them different species for 100 years, and they look different, and they're consistently different. But the DNA they used didn't separate them out. And so that becomes that challenge of figuring out which genes should we look at, which ones should we study and sequence, so as to help us find those differences, and then ask the question of, what do those differences mean? And that ultimately becomes the part, because what you want to do in the end is find differences in DNA and then use that to consistently be able to see and recognize those different forms. In this case, with this gorge rhododendron and the Carolina rhododendron, we've got some visible differences, and now we've got to tie that into DNA and see if we can find it consistently in different spots. The Smoky Enum up there in the national park, they found the right genes to show that that's nicely and distinctly different compared to the other three of those so-called lepidote species. So they feel confident about that. Does that answer your question?
I believe so. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Folks, we have about 5 minutes remaining. So if you have any last questions, let's please get those in. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, our speaker especially.
Very good.
And I've enjoyed this talk, and enjoy hearing questions, because sometimes it gets me thinking, even though I don't have a good answer. It's like, oh, that would be a good thing to think about further. So those are all, and every time I give a presentation on these azaleas, somebody comes up with a question I don't have an answer for. But that gets me thinking about, why don't we have an answer for it? So these are always good times to share information, and I'm going to be the first to admit I don't know everything about these things, and I keep on learning. Each time I go out in the field, I see something different and say, wow, what's happening there? What's going on? Why is it doing this? And some of those questions you've come up with, you know, flowering time, what the flowers look like, and asking those tough questions about why is that? We don't have answers yet.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've got any relatives or children that are going off to college, you can say, hey, here's a nice project to work on for your master's or PhD.
Well, Dr. Horn, I want to thank you on behalf of the chapter for all the information you've shared with us, and for leading a wonderful field trip this past weekend to the Congaree Bluffs. We look forward to working with you more in the future on that area, and perhaps some other areas as well. I would like to ask our president, Bill McCullough, if he had any comments for the group before we sign off for tonight.
Not really. I think you covered it. I would like to thank the Richland County Master Gardeners for letting us use their Zoom, and thank you and Lynn for publicizing and organizing both the field trip and the program, and of course for Dr. Horn for giving such an informative program tonight, and a very fun field trip on Saturday. And don't forget,
thanks to all of you who took time out to attend tonight.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. It's always nice talking to the folks that are excited about things I talk about.
All right. Okay. Well, hearing no other questions, everyone have a good evening.
Okay, thanks, Bob.
Okay, good
Thanks
evening.
again, Dr. Horn.
Bye.
Bob, you're
Good night.
your Dutchman's pipe's ready.
Excuse me?
Your Dutchman's pipe, your pipeline, whenever you
Oh, yeah,
are ready
great.
to plant it, it is ready to come.
I'm ready. All right. Thanks
Okay.
again, everyone.